We are meeting with Bishop David Bernard and Brother Carlton Coon. We're talking about mentorship, the importance of mentorship, the importance of connecting with people, engaging with individuals to help leaders grow in ministry. A couple of questions for both you gentlemen. I'm going to start with you, Bishop Bernard.
Okay.
I want to ask you, why is mentorship important? More specifically, why do I need a mentor?
Well, I think it's a biblical principle that we don't serve God in isolation. We serve God as part of a community. We need elders in our lives. We need people who can guide us, people who can advise us. You know, some things you learn by experience, but as much as possible, if you can learn from other people's experience, that's a shortcut.
Absolutely.
So a mentor can help us be a good role model, can share with us their successes, failures, what they've learned, some things they've learned the hard way, so that hopefully we can build on what they've learned instead of having to start from scratch ourselves.
Absolutely. To the person who is intending on being a mentor, how do you become a mentor to someone? Is it something that just happens? Is it something that you have to really work at and be intentional about? Is it a combination of both? And what would you say to that person?
I think it's a combination. First of all, if you want to be a mentor, you need to have submitted to mentors in your life. So it's a natural thing. And often a mentor, it could be because you are in a position as a pastor or some other minister that you naturally have younger people that you're responsible to lead. In other situations, there may be no formal relationship, but you're just a senior member of the church that maybe the pastor will encourage you to reach out to some people, or people may just gravitate toward you. Some may come and say, I just want to learn from you. Some of it can be informal. It starts with fellowship, going out to dinner and sharing ideas. It may come from your role as a teacher or youth worker or pastor. So I would say it's a combination of informal and formal, but at some level it needs to be intentional, where not that you're the expert, not that you know it all, but you feel like you have some life experience and you have some things you've learned from God that you're willing to share. And so the intentional part is you have to make time for that. Absolutely. And you have to reach out to people. You can't mentor just in just with an outline of, I'm going to do this. It has to be labor intensive, so to speak. It has to be a relationship more than just teaching.
Awesome. For you, Brother Coon, that young man who is being mentored by his pastor, who feels a burden to start a church, what would you tell him?
Well, I think it's important that he absorbs everything he can from his pastor, and particularly in the context of evangelism and then influencing people. We use the term leader, but I think sometimes that gets positional, and what we really have to learn is how to influence people, both people that we're trying to reach with the gospel, and then also people who are converted, but we're trying to shape them and send them a certain direction. So it's kind of this transitional thing. Paul told Timothy, you take what and I'm paraphrasing, you take what I've given you and you give it to other faithful men, and we'll give it to other faithful men. So there's a generational transition. He needs to get close to his pastor. He needs to learn everything he can from that man who is in his life and allow that man to be a spiritual father for him. So, and then I think sometimes fellows are in settings where maybe their pastor has not or is not currently a church planter. Maybe it's been a long time since he was in that setting. It's important to ask questions of people who are not far down the road. Maybe it's been 10 years since they started a church, and learn from several. Mentoring and the mentor-protege experience is not limited to one person. In life, through the process of time, I've had quite a number of different mentors who I learned specific different things, and in some instances they were there for a season for me to gain certain things from them, and then the relationship changed or somebody else moved into the picture to some degree.
Awesome. And actually, you mentioned the pastor being not very far down the road, and that was going to be another question that I asked. What would you say to that pastor who has a young man in his church who wants to start a church but has not been in the role of a church planner? Because it's important to guide properly. So.
I think you have to put, as a pastor, I would encourage the young man to connect with other church planners. One of the things I encourage our local licensed preachers to do is to just go visit a relatively new church planter, one that's 3 months, 6 months, a year old, where they're still putting the chairs out, where they're still having to set up and tear down every week. It's a very different setting. It's a very different dynamic than walking in and the pews are in place and the sound system's there. And so that becoming familiar, being put in the setting to observe those things and to say, wow, this is what this is about. He needs to know what he's getting into. So as a pastor, I'm going to encourage him, hey, you may not be going to preach for this fellow, but you need to go observe. You need to go ask him questions.
Absolutely.
You need to learn what's involved in this.
Absolutely. And Bishop Bernard, is there anything that you would say to that pastor to help encourage him to be more mindful of or more focused on planting churches?
Well, I think the pastor needs to be sensitive to opportunities. A pastor is focused on building his local church, which is right, as he should be, but the pastor needs to be thinking, is God trying to open a door that's bigger? For instance, a Bible study. If people are living a certain distance away, or maybe it's another ethnicity or another language group, or maybe it's an area of town or a suburb or neighboring town where there's no church. Instead of just thinking, well, I can win one soul and add them to the church, you might say, I wonder if this could be an opportunity for something bigger. You know, if there's a family that starts gathering, you got 10 people coming every week,
Absolutely.
then start thinking of options. And so that's what I did as a pastor when I had someone who lived in some of those categories. I would start thinking, could this be an opportunity? Or when someone would come to me saying, I feel a call to preach, and they would go through the training and they seem to be fairly stable. Of course, I would urge them to get involved in winning souls. But as they would start winning souls doing Bible studies and so on, then I would look, I wonder if this could be the nucleus of starting a church. So I think the pastor has to be aware of the opportunities for a preaching point or a daughter work, instead of simply just looking at it as evangelism generically, but try to ask God, what are you trying to do in this situation?
Absolutely. And just maybe one or two more questions. We know missionaries, we have metro missionaries, urban missionaries, we have missionaries that we send out to different places. Talk to that person, that pastor or that young man who wants to be a missionary about both types of opportunities, and if both of you will.
Okay, I think it's important, and I've already touched on this, it's important for a person to be aware of what a church plant's like. That's a first thing. And if God's called him to that, he will see some things that he may look at as a challenge, but there are learned behaviors that can be effective. The various ways that churches are started in North America. Number one, the most effective is where a mother church starts a preaching point. That preaching point becomes a daughter church. Eventually it becomes autonomous, and hopefully both of those churches become mother churches again in their own right. The second is where a missionary goes, and this is by far the greatest. A man is a bivocational pastor. Brother Bernard was a bivocational church planter when he started the church in Austin. I was a bivocational missionary as well. And there's challenges there, obviously. A guy doesn't have as much time to give to the church work as he would have if he were able to be full-time. But the flip side of that is quite often the workplace affords the opportunity to connect people. That is kind of a natural process. We assist many of our church planners with Christmas for Christ, and unless a guy can live extremely inexpensively, that's never going to cover all of their costs. You mentioned Metro Missions. Metro Missions is an approach where that it's equivalent to a global missionary in the sense that the individual deputizes, they become, they go on site full time, and this is approved by any number of different levels, including the executive board. One that we added just last year that I'm really excited about, the possibilities with it, is North America Forward. And this is basically a way to fund people who are veteran church planners, where that they can be full-time starting additional churches, hopefully, not just an additional church, but multiple churches. And the objective here is career church planners, people who are going to spend their whole life starting churches. They may not be in a metro setting. So that's some of the approaches. I really like the intercultural missionary evangelist thing that we've got going, where that a person goes in and helps an existing church establish a toehold working with a Spanish or African immigrant, or we even have one fellow who helps with Native Americans. You know, those are some various things. We do have opportunities in various settings for a young man who maybe, or a young lady who's a college student, to go and be an intern for a summer and learn what North American missions and church planning is all about. So that kind of gives an overview from 40,000 feet, I guess.
Okay. Anything that you'd like to add?
Well, I would reiterate that, but say if a young minister feels a burden to start a church and focuses on an area, the first thing is to check with his pastor to see if a preaching point or daughter work is an option. I think that's by far the best for most situations. But if he definitely feels a call to go to another location and start a church from scratch, there are various options. But I would say he should go to the district superintendent, the presbyter, the district North American missions director, and upon their advice, probably even try to connect with a pastor in the area. And so discuss the options, not just from the general level of how you could get funded, but at that district level. What do they recommend? What do they see as the opportunities and obstacles? You know, what kind of help, both financially and mentoring or others, that they would provide. And so you do your research and you come to be part of a team. You don't come just out of nowhere just to do your own thing.
Right.
You come to add to what's already being done in that area.
Correct. So like a net or a meshwork, you're adding strength, or you're.
So you can see from what I've said, either way, I'm recommending a team approach rather than a solo approach.
Awesome.
Well, one of the terms we use sometimes is that we've unfortunately just sometimes parachuted folks in. We kind of push them out of the plane and we'll see you if you survive, but that hasn't worked real well. So what Brother Bernard's describing is much more effective. And we actually have districts that when a person comes to start a church, even if he is moving from another part of the country, they immediately connect him and his family with a pastor and a church. And the district's instruction is that once a week, you're to be in this church. This man is your pastor. You're to stay with that until this pastor feels that your work is far enough along that you don't need their sustenance and undergird. And it's worked extremely well. It's one of our fastest growing districts.
Awesome. Well, one of the goals that we have is to help encourage and mentor and develop, and so that's the reason for this conversation is just to make sure that we provide some resources to make sure that young ministers have what they need or have the guidance that they need in order to be successful and effective in ministries. Thank you both very much for your time. I appreciate that.
Appreciate it.